I am Ray Redacted. If you've ever heard of me before, it's probably from either Darknet Diaries or Tribe of Hackers or Twitter or X or whatever we're calling it this week. And we're going to go on a really crash course whirlwind tour of the history of hacking, and especially with an emphasis around the history of AI, artificial intelligence. So I kind of already did the who am I? Who are you? I think this audience has got its fair share of cynics about artificial intelligence, about people that are probably a little tired of hearing that term even at this conference. I myself am an AI optimist. I am a self-confessed AI optimist, but I certainly recognize that especially in our industry, AI has been hyped at least 2 or 3 different cycles. As a matter of fact, we're going to talk about the AI winters and its effects across the board. But usually, the reason that people talk about AI is because if you have a crack in the wall around statistics, you could frame it and call it machine learning, or you could frame it and call it AI and try to draw a crowd and their money. Now, the nice thing about teaching a class like this is when it comes to terms, you get to make up your own terms, right? You can define your own. And so I'm not going to read you the alternate choices. You can see these pretty quick as they flash by, but you can pick your own definition for AI. It could be something around a parking spot. It could be about natural stupidity being solved with artificial stupidity, right? Or even being able to, and this is actually kind of a throwback to the keynote that Grifter was in yesterday as well, is when you realize you're not the smartest one in the room, even among non-human entities, et cetera. So, and of course, this one is definitely my favorite one. It's the AI side. Now, when we talk about artificial intelligence, just to kind of level set, because this is a beginner course, we really have to talk about. Oh, I left that one in there for you, Jake, as well, just in case. Okay, but we really have to kind of talk about artificial intelligence. It actually is a pun. The word artificial there takes on a lot of meaning because artificial means fake. Right? So artificial meaning it's not real intelligence. It means synthetic, right? It means non-organic. And it can mean all of these things at once. But by the academic definition, it's really about computers being able to perform tasks that appears to be like human perception, reasoning, planning, acting. And then the big one, of course, is learning. And is it reasoning? Is it thinking? If we do these air quotes enough, I'll probably burn off a bunch of calories just from throwing those fingers up throughout the time frame. But that's sort of the way we look at AI from the framing standpoint. Now, everyone these days wants to talk about LLMs. That's large language models. But in the hierarchy of the way you look at AI is the science, right? That's like physics or biology. Then there's machine learning. A subset of that is deep learning. A subset of that is generative. And then a tiny subset of that subset is what we call LLMs. And that's the reason that's kind of important is because these terms have been abused for 50 years, right? And people throw around those terms as if they're synonymous. And in some ways they might be, right? They could be interchangeable, but in many ways they absolutely are not. 2 of the main things that you have to kind of think about when we're thinking about these big, massive revolutions that have happened even in the last 19 months is the concept of training and the concept of inference. And I always like to use the bicycle analogy because I think it was Steve Jobs that kind of envisioned the personal computer. This is the Apple II Plus, the 6502-based personal computer, as being like a bicycle, right? Being able to enhance man's being able to walk, being able to be kind of a force multiplier, et cetera. And it turns out that when you've been calling American Airlines for years and years and years, and it says this call may be recorded for training purposes, they never really told us that it might be training a what instead of a who, right? And training ultimately is about unique data sets being sent into these models so that it could be associated with cognitive functions around the human mind side. Now, there are 3 terms that are almost table stakes when we talk about AI. And these are also overused and abused. And there's an eternal fight about where we are on this hierarchy. But we are for sure around ANI, and that is not automatic number identification for the phone freaks in the room. ANI was its own term before AI came along and hijacked it. It's moving to AGI, and eventually most people believe that once you hit AGI, it's inevitable you're going to hit ASI. And the distinction there is that we already have AIs that can do specific tasks better than humans can be in that narrow field, right? Because I don't have perfect recall, because I don't have petabytes and petabytes of log files memorized, right? They can do one task. AGI is about being able to do kind of all those tasks. And then ASI, which is the real scary one, is about when the computers are using AGI to basically reprogram themselves to invent new sciences and new ways of thinking that perhaps humans can't even understand. Okay, and if you're the type of person that believes in these types of things, that might be like a deity type once you reach godlike status, right? And for many of us who got into hacking originally because it made you feel that power of being able to change the world around you, you know that once you give somebody root, it's very difficult to take it back, right? And ultimately, that's the fear around ASI. And also, it is what merits the ethical debate that's outside the scope of today, but about, are we moving too fast? And are we accelerating too fast towards this? And is it truly inevitable? There are a lot of scientists who believe that it is inevitable and that it can't be stopped. And so we really shouldn't even be talking about it. I happen to not really be in that camp. But the stages across these are, most people agree that today we're in ANI. Today we actually experience or have AI that's in narrow intelligence, narrow field, very specifically mimicking human thought, mimicking cognition and memories, but only for specific domains. And most people believe that the risk level currently is low, that it does not have direct access to our nuclear facilities, at least we hope not. Certainly not in charge of SCADA systems. But when we get to the part where AGI kicks in, the risk profile also increases as well, because there's a lot of things that happen in that movement from ANI to AGI that if you made it to Jake Williams' talk yesterday, there was a lot of discussion around black box versus white box. We can't really see what's happening in the middle part on the black box side in order to basically monitor it and keep it, behaving ethically. But certainly around ASI, that's the level where we absolutely will not be able to understand, because of the limited experiences we have even simulating ASI. When you ask the model to explain how it came to a conclusion, its answer is it's beyond your human understanding. So that is the level where it's now, and this is of course theoretical. This is not real, no matter what Sam Altman or Elon Musk likes to say late at night. But that's the part where that is highly risky and is somewhat uncontrollable. And most people think, in terms of movies, that ASI is really like Skynet. That's the point when it becomes a battle that may never end. Again, beyond the limits of human capability. So ANI, AGI, ASI. Lots of folks think that we're going to see AGI in the next 10 years. I happen to think we're going to see it in the next 10 months. Okay, I think in limited ways, we actually could see it even today. If you really squint hard and maybe have a couple beverages before you do the analysis, that part. And then ASI is generally considered to be something that happens very rapidly. Now, it's possible that ASI never actually happens, right? But there's a lot of reasons to think that AGI leads to ASI. So let's talk about history, because this is a history lesson. It all really began with Alan Turing. And for those of you that remember the Hollywood movie, The Imitation Game, this was about code breaking, about being able to decipher and read encoded messages that were designed not to be. But he was a cryptographer, invented the logic engine, and in many ways invented the digital computer age, right? That invented also something called the Turing test, which was real simple. Could a normal human being not be able to discern whether the entity on the other side of the keyboard was human or not? Okay, that's the Turing test, right? And at the time, it was thought, wow, would we ever get to the point where machines, could pass the Turing test? And we certainly, again, that wasn't necessarily thought to be inevitable either. But my story really begins for you at the MIT. At the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, there was a building at MIT called Building 26 that was scheduled to be torn down. And in a college campus, when you have a building scheduled to be torn down, People don't necessarily enforce the rules nearly as much. And they got up to shenanigans at Building 26. And when I say they got up to shenanigans, this is the birth of hacking. This is the birthplace of hacking. And it all started with a railroad club. They were basically playing with tech model railroad clubs in this horrible ass looking building that is the birthplace of hacking, even the term hacking. They would come together and put together these architectures in order to switch railroads. Okay. And so if you think about some of the equipment that was involved, it's somewhat ridiculous to think in terms of how amazing this all originated from there. Over time, this group of men, and it was mostly white men in their 20s and 30s, this turned into a drinking club as well. It became a social place to go to, and they came up with certain things. And one of the things that they would do was called midnight requisitions. And a midnight requisition was when you broke into the phone company and stole some shit, okay? So you would get some equipment, and it would really help you with your phone. You had the most advanced switched tech model railroads and railroad system that's out there. And there's a lot of parallels between circuit switching in the telephone world and switching railroad clubs. And these were very, very sophisticated side. They even had different clicks for the folks that did the programming and didn't. Now, one of the things that was interesting about the programming, and this is some of the central office equipment that was being taken at midnight requisitions, and in some cases it was returned, and in some cases it wasn't. But some of these students wanted code time. And the way that they would actually get code time is something called code bumming. And here's the way it worked. Everything was on timeshare computer systems. And if you had a task that was 140 program cards, okay, and that person was going to run those numbers at 1 a.m. or 1:30 a.m. because they ran these machines 24 hours a day to do the punch cards. If I had a program that I wanted to run that was 22 cards, and I knew a professor had one that was 140, if I could optimize his code down from 140 to 118, I could sneak my program in and basically bum that time. It was called code bumming. This is the first terms of hacking. As a matter of fact, an internal memo actually chastised the members of this club, which included Marvin Minsky that we're going to get to in just a minute, and said, we're now requesting that anyone's working or hacking on the electrical systems, please cut that out. Okay, we're doing that. And that's the actual first published use of the term hacking to mean manipulating or modifying. Now, I should disclaim this up front and tell you, when I use the term hacking, I'm talking about the sense of curiosity, the sense of exploration, the goal to do more with less. I refuse to accept the hijacking of that term to mean malicious activity, and I suspect that most of you do agree with me as well. Is that accurate? Okay, I got some feedback on that one. So some of these guys, John McCarthy, Alan Kotak, and especially Marvin Minsky, they were always interested in AI. That was always the mission. From the time that hacking was first defined, they were talking about machine-aided cognition. Okay, that MAC, machine-aided cognition, was about being able to help you see if computers could ever think. Alan Turing had bravely asked, do you think computers will ever think? These gentlemen went forward with the assumption that it would happen. So that was the concept of code bumming was ultimately the first ever hacks. And that's the purest sense of the word hack too, by the way. You're optimizing someone else's code. You're not ruining their program. You're not hurting it. And then of course you're getting just, your benefit from them and the world is better across the board. Their ethos was that information wants to be free. Information shall be free, and it should be. But they were also distrustful of authority. And that carries over for the entire culture of the hacking culture for all generations, and that they could create art and beauty. And I would say that if you fast forward many years to the Hackers Manifesto and even certainly some of the movies, this has been a universal ever since. So this was sort of the founding moments around that concept. Now, October 4th, 1957, everything changed. Everything in the entire world changed, and we're going to talk about the massive ripple effects of that. Does anybody take a guess and tell me what happened at this date, at this time? Sputnik. As a matter of fact, Sputnik was so impactful that if I'm not careful, I'm going to refer to Sputnik moments as being one of those monumental events in the history of AI that absolutely changed everything. But ultimately, what Sputnik was, and I think most of the people in this crowd are probably about my age, so you probably know this as well. But Sputnik has been represented when we were in elementary school and middle school as the Soviet Union placed a satellite in geosynchronous orbit, rotated around the Earth a few times. But they never really explained to us what the implication of that really was that the Soviet Union basically put into technology that they could put a bomb in there as well and be anywhere in the world before your radar systems could detect it, right? That was the heavy implication of Sputnik. And the United States, collectively, society, government, and scientists lost our shit. We completely freaked out over this, okay? And we freaked out in a good way. We very much emphasized science and security because this was going to be a battle of life or death, and they had beaten us in the race to space. And this ultimately led to the Department of Defense Directive 5105, which founded something called DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. And DARPA, one of their first ever initiatives was Project Mac. And depending on who you ask, that was either multiple access computing or it was machine-aided cognition. That was Project Mac, and it was built around those concepts. But it really was about linking together these computer networks. I just lost my visuals for a second. Linking these computer networks across the United States into what eventually became known as the ARPANET and eventually the Internet. Do you want me to unplug and replug? Okay. It became known as the ARPANET and eventually the Internet, the global Internet. And it was built to be decentralized in the sense that it would survive atomic bomb runs. They were there. It is saying it's connected, by the way. Mm-hmm. Now, by the way, if anyone's hacking the projector, please take that back to DEF CON, okay? Because I don't want to be messed with. Anyway, so that was the founding of ARPANET. That was really ultimately about that side. So the other thing that it actually started was a program that actually ended up funding and financing a program called ELIZA. Now, most people think ELIZA, because it's written in all capital letters, is an acronym for something, but it's not. It was actually a reference to a play, the Doolittle effect. Eliza Doolittle was a character in a play where he taught her to fake like she was from a higher society than she was, right? So he's teaching her to speak and pretend to be a higher society than it was. And Eliza was about faking different roles, but one of them was a Rogerian therapist. And this is what a Rogerian therapist would do. If you told it a problem, it used reflective listening to say things like, and how do you feel about that? And I'm going to show you an actual example. So this is what it would look like to interact with Eliza.
A computer program that anyone can converse with via the keyboard, and it'll reply on the screen. We've added human speech to make the conversation more clear.
Men are all alike.
In what way?
They're always bugging us about something or other.
Can you think of a specific example?
Well, my boyfriend made me come here.
Your boyfriend made you come here?
He says I'm depressed much of the time.
I'm sorry to hear that you're depressed.
It's true. I am unhappy.
Do you think coming here will help you not to be unhappy?
The computer's replies seem very understanding, but this program is merely triggered by certain phrases to come out with stock responses.
It's faking it.
Nevertheless, Weizenbaum's secretary fell under the spell of the machine.
And I asked her to my office and sat her down at the keyboard, and then she began to type. And of course, I looked over her shoulder to make sure that everything was operating properly. After 2 or 3 interchanges with the machine, she turned to me and she said, "Would you mind leaving the room, please?"
And yet she knew, as Weizenbaum did, that Eliza didn't understand a single word that was being typed into it.
So it was faking it. It was faking it. And just like Jake Williams said yesterday, I got to be careful not to anthropomorphize these non-human entities by using pronouns that imply as a person, but it was faking it. It was using pattern recognition and substitution, okay, not very much code at all, to basically reflect back to the listener. And here's what's so crazy. Even though it was totally faking it, and even though the users were told it was faking it, they still interacted with it in a way that looked like a human being would. That's called the Eliza effect. And it has huge implications when we talk about GPT, when we talk about the LLMs of today. Even if you know it's not a person, there's a part of your brain just based on the interaction that's there that treats it as if it's a person. This is the classic thing about my wife apologizing to Alexa, or me using the words please and thank you to Siri, right? That's the ELIZA effect in action. It also really established the fact that if you fake it enough, if the program can fake it enough, at some point, it's no longer faking it, because that's what it is doing. That's actually its role, is to fake it to that point.
Boards were replaced.
Now, this sense of exploration, this sense of discovery bled over from the college campus to the largest computer network in the world at the time, the PSTN. That's the Public Switched Telephone Network. And that was epitomized by this. This was basically what
boards
this
were
looked
replaced by mechanical systems. Different noises were used to trigger the switches. If you had perfect pitch like blind phone freak Joe and Grecia, you could whistle calls through the network.
Let's see if I make it this time. Okay, this is really hard to do. It sounded like all the tones were present, so phone should be ringing about now. Okay, it hit the phone. It just takes a little while.
He even showed off his skills for the local media.
From his one phone to a town in Illinois and back to his other phone. A 1,000-mile phone call by whistling.
So the blind kids would go to summer camp,
these things because
and they would see each other at summer camp,
technology.
and they wanted to talk to each other during the rest of the year, and so they would teach each other how to jump on the telephone system and get long-distance calls for free, using basically in-band signaling tones. So when we think about DTMF, that's dual-tone multi-frequency, or this, the telephone engineers at Bell designed this system so that it was supposed to be noises that the human voice would never necessarily make, right? That whistle tone that he was making, the one I'm going to show you in just a second, was supposed to be unreachable. Certainly DTMF, because it was dual tone multi-frequency, right? That was there. But the blind kids were teaching each other how to do this. And of course, the pranks would ensue, like crazy afterwards. So that was Joe Ingrassia. He legally changed his name to Joy Bubbles. He is in what is arguably the greatest hacker movie of all time, maybe the second greatest hacker movie of all time. Sneakers was based on his character. He was a ham radio enthusiast, and he was a blind phone freak. He legally became known as Joy Bubbles. This ushered in the age of freaking, and that's spelled with a PH as a pun, as kind of a wink and a nod. And it was all about Bell Telephone. And at the end of the day, the yippies and the folks under Abby Hoffman felt like the war in Vietnam was immoral, and it was their moral duty to steal telephone calls from state to state, because that would rob Bell of its revenue streams, because the Vietnam War was primarily financed by Bell telephone taxes, which is kind of an interesting data point. So the first ever e-zine that was published by the Yipples, the youth part of the YIPLs, literally told you how to generate your own credit card tones based on any phone number and steal the phone service. Again, this wasn't considered stealing. It was considered your moral duty to do this in order to fight the war, etc. So this is also when boxes became ushered in. This is a red box. It made the tone. Now, Sam, once upon a time, there were pay telephones where people put coins into the machines, and you would actually pay to make a phone call. And this simulated the sounds around quarters. And that's what you're hearing, that repeated sound right there. But the boxes that was probably best known is the blue box. And just like with that in-band signaling we were just talking about, a very special tone, 2600 hertz, would basically allow you to trunk and become an operator. You could go in-band signaling and make calls, connect calls, disconnect, do bridges, become an operator if you hit that 2600 hertz tone. And these were made from the really crappy low-end kind of things all the way up to the absolute Cadillac of blue boxes. And they were very, very popular on college campuses because it allowed you to use this in-band signaling that was part of SS5. Okay, later SS5 became replaced with something called SS7. But at the end of the day, this 2600 hertz tone would allow you to do a lot of things. One of the things that's the funniest of all was if you were walking by a bank of these pay telephones at a train station and you played this noise, it would knock everyone off the call that they were on, because they would suddenly go into the trunk mode, right? And in some parts of the world, you could still cause those kind of shenanigans. But Esquire magazine narked, okay? They published an article that was supposedly fiction that really described in great detail these machines and what they were being used for. And a guy out west, in the west side, found this article, and then this basically ensued.
Well, as I was talking to Steve Jobs on the phone, I said, it occurred to me that, wait a minute, they're giving too much information about certain frequencies and certain codes. There's too much information here. this doesn't sound right for fiction. And so we decided to go check some of it out. So on a Sunday, we went to, where's the technical library you can sneak into on a Sunday? Oh, we picked the Stanford Linear Accelerator Center. Question, you go to any of these places, in the high research, the very pure theoretical research type places, and boy, I'll tell you, there's no such thing as a closed door in that door. So we always found our way in. And we'd go up to the library and read all the computer magazines every week, and we found a book on the telephone system, and it had the same frequencies that were mentioned in this article. It was called Fiction. And we looked at each other and realized that we had stumbled onto something that was not fiction.
Now, that's Steve Wozniak, of course, and he was the brains. He was the engineer behind what later became known as Apple Computer. But there was another Steve involved, and he was the sales guy. Nothing against sales folks, but he was more of the sales guy and more of the hustler. And his take on it is a little different.
One of the things that Woz and I did was we built blue boxes. They were devices that you could build. When you make a long-distance phone call in the background, you hear, those are the telephone computers actually signaling each other, sending information to each other to set up your call. There used to be a way to fool the entire telephone system into thinking you were a telephone computer and to open up itself and let you call anywhere in the world for free. And these were illegal, I have to say. But in spite of that, we were so fascinated by them that Woz and I actually figured out how to build one. We built the best one in the world. It was the first digital blue box in the world. But it was the magic of the fact that two teenagers could build this box for $100 worth of parts and control hundreds of billions of dollars of infrastructure in the entire telephone network in the whole world. That was magical. And experiences like that taught us the power of ideas, the power of understanding that if you could build this box, you can control hundreds of millions of dollars worth of telephone infrastructure around the world. That's a powerful thing. And that, if we hadn't have made blue boxes, there would have been no Apple.
There would have never been an Apple. Okay, they were using this money to basically finance building the breadboards for the Apple I and eventually the Apple II, right? And if you think about that, what's so crazy about that was Wozniak was a true hacker, right? He really liked to engineer things to be smaller and better and more efficient, power supply-wise and everything else. But if you think about it, they ended up developing this handheld device that's much, much smaller than the blue box at the time. And I would argue that it's about as elegant, right? The iPhone, and it actually does control the world's infrastructure across the entire world. Now, they were expensive. As a matter of fact, the Wozniak one, which I think was $299, was a lot of money back then, but mobsters would pay it because they could run their numbers at things, from coast to coast. But it was a pest. Bell was annoyed by it, but it was a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of the number of phone calls that were happening that weren't being logged or weren't being correctly done. And surely there was never a threat scenario that included the idea that perhaps an American food company would put a whistle into the hands of every single kid who bought a box of Captain Crunch, because it turned out that a prize cereal box actually generated this 2600 hertz tone. Now, once you put that out there and all the kids do that, both these whistles, by the way, demand a very, very pretty penny on eBay if you've got an original one, so as does the Wozniak Blue Box. But what in the world does this have to do with AI? We've been listening to people talk about things around security vulnerabilities and around prompt injection and around these large language models and non-deterministic testing and things like that. Well, I'll tell you what it has to do with that, okay? Yesterday, Malware Jake stood on this stage, or a stage very similar to this one, and talked about the fact that there are attacks that about prompt engineering, okay? And if you think about it, that prompt engineering, what Malware Jake was basically saying was that you're never going to be able to separate the signal, the data plane from the control plane in the LLMs, because it's there by design to be that way, right? And so ultimately, that's what this prompt injection really is about. And this was my attempt to be cute or coy about it, because inside that message, that on modems back then, by the way, in the Hayes Communications modem set, if you typed in plus, and it had to be timed just right, had to be right no matter how many milliseconds, then you could actually disconnect somebody else's phone too as well, because it would also take their modem offline as well, and you would get this garbage and then no carrier that was there. So, but what he was talking about yesterday was that you can't, to use these directly, that you can actually input cross-site scripting or SQL injection, and you can't possibly say just sanitize input because the output is unstructured. You can't just do that. Otherwise, you're going to be playing whack-a-mole forever. So this is the same thing. This is that 2600 hertz tone brought up 40 something years into our modern world, right? And it's the exact same concept because it's in band signals. Does that make sense? Do I see any heads nodding? Do you see the parallels there? Okay, and ultimately, this is a very good point because I think Jake said something like, time is a flat circle or everything repeats itself, right? I would actually argue that not only is time a flat circle, but it's always been this way, right? We're still talking about some of the same types of injections, et cetera. But something massive happened in 1983/1984, okay? Another Sputnik moment in the history of at least one hacker, because I was 12 years old when this happened, at least one hacker, and that was this.
What are you doing?
Dialing into the school's computer. They change the password every couple of weeks, but I know where they write it down.
And a promising student at an old game
Hi.
with an electronic twist.
Those your grades?
Yeah. I don't think that I deserved it. Do you?
You could go to jail for that.
Only if you're over 18. This computer
Double
company's
entendre,
coming out with
anyone?
these amazing new games in a couple of months. I want to play those games. Wow. We got something.
He found the right code word to play the game,
We're in.
but it was the wrong computer.
Now, that was Whopper, by the way, WOPR. This movie holds up shockingly well after as many years as it's been, okay? And it had massive influences on our hacker culture, on our laws, on everything else. But there were some pretty big lessons that actually happened. One was it showed red boxing, or the Hollywood equivalent of being able to steal from pay phones. The concept of what David Lightman was doing in this movie, he was dialing every single phone number in a given NPA and XX looking for carrier tones because the modems that would answer the phones at 3 a.m. or 4 a.m. typically were unauthenticated. It was just like it was a Unix terminal that was there. Or they had hard-coded credentials like admin, or root, whatever that was, right? And even the conference DEF CON was named in kind of a nod to defense conditions that were referenced in this movie. Right? But one of the biggest influences it ever had, especially to a 12-year-old hacker in Dallas, Texas, was it convinced a bunch of pre-adolescent boys that if you hacked, you could get the girl. So think about that. So what happens when you get a bunch of 12-year-old boys who think that if they hack, they can get laid? Or whatever the concept was before that, I guess I would say. Everyone went out and bought modems. We had a massive rise of bulletin board systems all over the United States as these boys rushed to put 300 baud and 110 baud and even 1,200 if you were rich baud modems out there. And bulletin board systems popped up all over the place. Now, I will tell you a funny story about this. Ronald Reagan saw this movie. They put a movie theater in the White House. So they updated the movie theater that was already there. And he watched this movie and came into a meeting very, very excited and animated. Okay, about it. And he sat around a table with his Joint Chiefs of Staff and he asked them, I've just seen this movie. Could this happen? And we know what happened next because it was documented.
And says, has anybody seen this movie, War Games? Nobody's seen it. It just came out. He goes into this enormous plot description. People are looking around, wondering where this is going. Then he turns to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General John Vesey, and says, General, could something like this really happen? Could someone just break into our most secure computers? And the general says, I'll look into that, Mr. President. He comes back a week later and says, Mr. President, the problem is much worse than you think. This leads to the government's first presidential directive on computer security.
So the first internal audit around security controls said it's way, way worse. I mean, by the way, that's a pretty interesting precedent to set. And we rushed forward legislation and controls that weren't necessarily thought out that much. Stop me if you know this song, if you've heard this tune before, in response to that. But War Games also showed some other things that actually are tied directly to AI and to machine learning, deep learning, and LLMs as well that we're going to talk about in just a minute. But in addition to the rise of BBSs all over the country, we also saw an explosion of written and historic literature about hacking, freaking, HPP, and piracy. Piracy was on there as well, Waresing, was there as well. David Lightman was looking for modem tones in a given NPA and XX because he thought he was looking for a video game that hadn't been released yet. The game had not been released yet, and he thought he was calling video game companies and going to find this game that was not tic-tac-toe, but it was global thermonuclear war, right? And he did not realize it was an actual real machine. So at 3 or 4 a.m., okay, in Plano, Texas, a 12-year-old boy would literally wake up every single person in the city looking for modem tones. You would go to sleep at night, or it's just a hypothetical 12-year-old boy would go to sleep at night, wake up in the morning, and get a printout of 5 or 6 numbers out of thousands dialed that had answered with a carrier tone, right? This is before fax machines kind of muddled all that up. And that was called war dialing. War dialing was literally brute forcing every single guessing once to see which numbers would. So when I think about the implications on that, now that we know about the health implications of sleep, how many people were woken up, and back then this was before caller ID too, right? So how many people were woken up in the middle of the night because we're looking for these carrier tones because we want to be able to call bulletin board systems, especially the ones that aren't published or were not out there. Now, once you join a bulletin board, you really wanted to find the leak section. There's a section called the leak area that had text files that you could read, but and they would have things about everything from brown box plans and cheese box plans to how to make bombs to all kinds of forbidden literature. These were text files, T files, E files, G files, whatever that was. But you didn't get to just show up and ask for the plans, okay? It was a multi-stage process. Number one of the funniest stages was you had to say, I'm not a cop. Because there's a disclaimer that said, if you're a police officer, you must tell us now, because somebody somewhere told somebody else that the police would have to out themselves. And that didn't make a lot of sense to anyone, including Jeff Moss. He was talking about that the other day. But you did that. And then you had to prove that you knew your way around. You were cool, right? And the way that you would actually do that is you would use leak speak. You would use numbers, substitutions for words. You would use misspellings. All of that was a way of doing in-band signaling. It's basically an alternate alphabet, and that's how you established that you were in that role. And by the way, this is from Wikipedia, and yes, I mean that Wikipedia, right? And that's where we get 1337. That number 1337 was LEET. Okay, it was actually 31337 that was there, but that's where you see a lot of remnants of that even today. So this is also when 0 days emerged, first time ever. If I was calling a bulletin board in Canada and I had 3-day wears, that means it would have been out for 3 days, okay? And if you wanted to top me, you could say, oh, I've got 2-day wears. Okay, maybe Jake had 1-day wears, but the grand one of all, one everybody wanted was a 0-day wears because they hadn't even been released. It hadn't even been out yet. And 0 days later became known as things that hadn't been patched before, right? That meaning in that term, O-day or 0-day originated in bulletin board systems when they were talking about how old the software was or how aged it was. So this also became when groups started forming. Now, there was no profit motive yet. People weren't paying money yet. This was really about kids playing pranks and jokes and collecting games that we never actually played. Okay? Spend time cracking the games. Spend time removing the copyright protection. Certainly spend time vandalizing the splash page to take off whatever jerk put its name on there before, because I want my name on there now. Right? And a lot of these systems are still around, today. I think it's really funny when you find these old text files on Jason Scott's textfiles.org, and it has like phone numbers, and it says, please don't call before 10 p.m. My mom will answer. Right? So at night, some of these kids would literally run a bulletin board system with thousands of dollars worth of video games and wares that they had to wait till their parents went to bed, and then they could unplug all the other phones in the house. Right? And I always thought that was particularly interesting. This was a one phone line system too. So if you were trying to call BBSs, you had a system where you would dial every number sequentially, sweeping around looking for one that would finally answer. Okay, in general, to move software, to move it in and out. So we have formation of groups started that way. Tribes formed, cliques formed. It was all about things like the Legion of Doom and the Cult of the Dead Cow. And by the way, if your mom found a printout of the Cult of the Dead Cow under your bed when you were in the 7th grade, she was more worried about you being in a cult than the fact that you were calling bulletin board systems in Lubbock, Texas, and then immediately calling the Soviet Union or whatever else after that, right? So but ultimately that was the Cult of the Dead Cow, and that's where a lot of the systems were. Now, this all culminated and built up to this really magical moment. This is a Sputnik moment in 1998, and this is what happened in 1998. A group of hackers from Loft Heavy Industries and some others were called before Congress, and Congress wanted to ask them if it was true that the internet was fragile. Okay, that's not quite how they phrased it, but you've got to check this out. If you've never seen this historic moment before, this is absolutely an epic moment. So, and I hope there's audio on this one too as well. You'll recognize some of the faces on both sides of the table during this discussion.
They'll be using their hacker names of Mudge, Wells, Brian Oblivion, Kingpin, Space Rogue, Tan, and Stefan. I hope my grandkids don't ask me who my witnesses were today, and especially in light of the fact that the Washington Post described you as rock stars of the computer hacking elite.
The person who breaks into the systems and undermines the network security, and that's what I do in my day job. Unfortunately, many times they would not improve the software until we actually went public with the findings.
Within 30 minutes, the 7 of you could make the internet unusable for the entire nation. Is that correct?
That's correct. Actually, one of us with just a few packets. Many of the problems that are out there that contribute to this lack of security are extremely simple. Buffer overflows are spottable in source code.
In your testimony that you given 30 minutes, you might be able to render the internet unusable. So what can we do? What try to protect against that?
The one method of doing that we were referencing there are several. There are dozens of them actually. So this is definitely a double-edged sword because when you give the information out,
right,
other people can figure out how to exploit it.
Yeah.
However, if you don't give the information out, the people out there can't protect themselves.
First time some big company has been compromised because of this. That it may fix itself.
Just a curious side note to that story, by the way. I've been teaching this class, for almost 10 years now at Black Hat, DEF CON in some form. And I finally just got around to asking him, I'm friends with Mudge, so I finally just got around to asking him, what was the exploit that you were talking about? There was just a few packets, right? But I assumed it was BGP or it was something involving the underlying signaling, et cetera. And it was all those things. It was all of the things that I'd imagined that I actually thought it was. There's 3 or 4 different ways, but it was also hyperbolic, right? It was definitely hyperbole, right? And the senators really, really laxed on how vulnerable the internet is. There's this group of 7 guys that could take the internet down significantly. Now, I think about that yesterday when I was flying here, or the day before, because there was an Amazon East outage the other day, right? And so the fragility that they were preaching about and talking about, time is a flat circle, right? It's still very much that's out there, et cetera. And we're going to talk about the effect on that one. Now, that actually led to the next big phase in both developments around hacking and around AI, and that ultimately is about this. In 2011, a very sophisticated, mind-blowing program that was eventually nicknamed or erroneously tagged as Stuxnet was released in the wild. It was a cyber weapon with a very, very specific goal that had absolutely mind-boggling technological innovations in it that had not been seen by the public before, okay? And its goal was very specific. It was designed to set back the nuclear centrifuge reactors at 3 different plants in Iran, okay? It was widely speculated that it may have been created by Israeli or American intelligence agencies, and I'm just not going to leave it at that. I'm just going to say it was widely speculated at the time. But what's really interesting about this was there were assumptions that were destroyed by Stuxnet. One of those assumptions was we always assumed that if a machine was air-gapped, meaning if it was not connected to another machine or to an internet or to a LAN, that it was invulnerable. It could not be hacked, right? Because there's nothing that could get in and get out of it. Stuxnet blew that paradigm out of the water because it did hop the air gap, okay? It did it in a way that isn't really necessarily hopping the air gap because it was using USB keys, but it was very specifically targeted with a very, very specific goal. Lots of times people think that Stuxnet was this irresponsible weapon that was a weapon of mass destruction. It actually was very, very targeted for very specific Siemens PLCs. It was very well sophisticated written, and it was signed by legitimate keys. Legitimate keys where there were Microsoft Windows drivers. And even today, you can take this code apart and there's still some things impressive about its polymorphism, about some of the codes around it. That wasn't the problem. The problem wasn't this was out and about. And it did spread all over the world. As a matter of fact, you can still see instances of this, which is technically rootkit.win32. You can still see it. It's actually still out there, today. The problem was it was reverse engineered. Of course, it was picked apart. Now, this is how it was covered at the time.
Last year, a computer virus called Stuxnet was discovered lurking in the databanks of power plants, traffic control systems, and factories around the world. 20 times more complex than any previous virus code, it had an array of capabilities. Among them, the ability to turn up the pressure inside nuclear reactors or switch off oil pipelines, and Stuxnet could tell the system operators everything was normal. Unlike most viruses, Stuxnet doesn't carry the usual forged security clearance that helps viruses burrow into systems. It actually had a real clearance, stolen from one of the most reputable computer technology companies in the world. It exploited security gaps that system creators are unaware of. These holes are known as 0 days, and the most successful viruses exploit them. The details of a 0 day can be sold on the black market for $100,000. Stuxnet took advantage of 20 0 days. To shut down the centrifuges that spin nuclear material at Iran's enrichment facilities. Stuxnet was a weapon, the first to be made entirely out of code. The most important question may not be who designed it, but who will redesign it. The evolution has been so fast that 9 months after its detection, the first virus that could crash power grids or destroy oil pipelines is available online for anyone to download and tinker with. It's an open source weapon. And there's no way of knowing.
So hyperbole aside, and there's quite a bit in that coverage, right? We haven't really had in the AI world or in the LLM world or in the deep learning world, we haven't really had a Stuxnet moment yet. Okay, and I maybe shouldn't even jinx it by even saying yet there. But I would argue that in many ways, Stuxnet was a Sputnik type moment, and there are parallels to these types of developments on the AI side. But this was when most of the hacking activity, most of the innovation was driven to another group called nation-state actors. And that is a very specific cybersecurity term, and you never abbreviate this term. Because if you abbreviate this term, it means something else entirely. Okay, it has a different term if you do that. So nation-state actors. Stuxnet basically told the world that two countries who are at peace with each other can launch cyber attacks for reconnaissance or to modify each other. That's all gloves are off. Everyone should actually have offensive capabilities. Of the I think it was G8 countries at the time, all 8 began spinning up their offensive capabilities, and it now became part of cyber defenses. It became a new domain for that side. Now, one of the things that I didn't really talk about on the war game side was one of the really most fascinating pieces of that movie was when it depicted the computer, Whopper, teaching itself how to play games. A big part of the development around AI has been computers modeling playing games, all the way back to tic-tac-toe, to coin flips, to eventually Go. Go is another strategic type game, to chess, right? And in these LLMs, one of the things that has to happen for the computer to exhibit learning-like behavior is it has to model every potential outcome, okay? Every single possible outcome and take a look down that. And we're going to talk about why that's relevant about GPT in just a moment. But ultimately, David Lightman tells the program, play against yourself, okay? And develop every single one. And eventually the computer comes to the conclusion that the only way to win this game is to not play it at all. Okay. And the moral of that story was about thermonuclear war. That was supposed to be, the computer was realizing, this game can't be won. And it actually shows that. Again, I would highly encourage you to watch that just because it holds up so well over time. But this is also when back propagation occurred. That computer was looking forward and backward on those tic-tac-toe games, and then it was taking that data now and it was propagating it back so that it would know not to make that move next time, right? Or not to, basically that loop led to something that eventually became known as neural networks. This was the big, massive innovation after the second AI winner, okay? Neural networks were basically the result of the fact that in the early 19th century, scientists began to realize that the human brain is not like the human heart or like a liver. It's not a single entity. It's actually circuits of neurons that are being fired in different paths and different ways depending on thoughts and ideas. Okay, that was a revolutionary idea. It displaced something called reticular theory, and basically they were able to show that this is how thoughts are formed. As a matter of fact, this is what thoughts are. is these are electrical pathways that could be represented in some sophisticated way as an electronic circuit. And here's the problem. We know what the input layer is, and we have an idea about the output layer, but these hidden layers in the middle, there may be thousands of those. In the human brain, there's definitely thousands, if not billions of those, right? And all of those paths are there. But backpropagation tells you that, hey, it's not a real good idea for you to, get in that car on prom night with Billy Joe after he's had 2 Miller Lights, right? That backpropagation tells you that what you should and shouldn't have done in the past. The reason this is so revolutionary for LLMs is the stuff that I've seen in the labs today where you have backpropagation across models. So you have different cloned instances across models. They can actually teach a future version of the model can teach a past version of itself, different types of data. And when we get to the part where we're going to talk about Grok in a minute, that's one of the Grok 4.0 big innovations is having different models run the same data and then compare notes as to how they got to the correct answer, right? That's called the chain of experts or panel of experts. And it has to do with, again, the appearance of logic and conclusion. So this is what forward propagation is, and that is what backward propagation is. And it eventually led to something called convoluted neural networks. And this is the explosion that has driven the LLMs that we now affectionately, refer to every single day with either cynicism or derision or optimism. I guess it depends on the mood. But this was convolutional neural networks. Again, designed to mimic human brains. Everything around artificial intelligence was designed, hey, how does it work in our brains? Okay, let's try to do that. And at some point, if it's faking it enough to where it's basically convincingly that way, that it actually can not only make these kind of decisions, but it can also generate. It can generate the content. Not only can it predict, and it's fascinating how this actually works, like in the case of GPT, from those channels. Do you remember when you had a BlackBerry or maybe it was an iPhone and you would type something and it would try to guess your next word, right? When you guessed that next word, you were training that model that was a good guess, right? Because it was what you were thinking, et cetera, right? That ultimately is what a lot of these models are doing. They're trying to predict what the next word should be in a sentence. It's actually tokens because it's not actually technically words and it's parameters, but ultimately they're really just trying to predict what the next word should be. Now, I'm going to abbreviate this next part really, really fast because I'm really worried about time here. But ultimately, in November of 2014, another big innovation happened, and that was all the employees at a movie company called Sony Pictures Entertainment came into work and had a message on their screen, horribly written, okay, saying, we got you, we've owned you, et cetera. And this was a attack by a nation-state actor, the Lazarus Group, which is the DPRK, North Korea, and they were pissed off. Does anybody remember what they were mad about? They were mad about a movie. There was a movie coming out that was making fun of Supreme Leader, and they were pissed about it, right? They were angry. And so they basically jumped into there, and it's exhibited something called asymmetry. Asymmetry is a really important concept in drone warfare, in cyber warfare, and that is the concept of one little figure can punch just as hard as a really, really big boy. So the DPRK can basically equalize the lack of equality among players by doing a ton of damage for very, very little money. As grim as this sounds, 9/11 was probably one of the most spectacular asymmetric attacks of all time because for every penny they spent on that attack, it cost billions of dollars to defend and to respond to, right? Without the resources. So famously, Sony's head of security, the vice president of charge of security, very famously told the CIO magazine that he's not going to put up a bunch of money to defend sensitive information because, I'm not going to invest $10 million. What the hell? What's it going to cost me, $1 million loss? Well, long story short, the Sony Pictures Entertainment breach ended up costing them closer to $1 billion. And it wasn't just because there was unreleased movies or scripts. It was because of something else. Every single employee at Sony had an unencrypted PST file that they stored their emails in. And most of them were even on their desktop. They had a PST file sitting on their desktop, unencrypted, that was there. And they were saving everything. And some of these emails were horrible. They cost people their jobs. Executives lost their minds because every executive in America wanted to know, am I protected against this? Should I be watching my emails, et cetera? This is an email Amy Pascal sent that went back and forth, right? Back and forth. Literally the kind of stuff that you would expect teenagers to send each other over text messages or Signal today, right? But ultimately it was that. There was a lot of stuff in there that was racist, very bad depictions. There was a lot of salary disparity information about how certain actresses were being paid much, much less than others, et cetera. And that reputational damage was real damage. The real damage to the corporation was that reputational damage. And it really did cause a lot of companies to respond. But they also left us a little file at the end, bonus.rar. So Rare Files was sort of the hacker elite version of Zip, right? It's a compression algorithm. It used to be if you went to a corporate office and the guy would plug in his projector, if you saw that RAR, icon on his desktop, you knew he was, you knew he'd been around the block. But bonus.rar was something they left behind. And what bonus.rar was a list of passwords that they had collected in this exfiltration. Okay, we don't have time to get into the exfiltration discussion about this, but one of the big lessons about Sony was if you can't catch the infiltration, you got to catch the exfiltration. If nothing else, you should have, because their alarms were going off like crazy. But when we walk through these passwords and we look at these, they had 31 employees whose password was Sony. Not Sony 123, not Sony exclamation point fall, it's just Sony, right? And they had been audited. And their auditors had told them, you have this horrible password hygiene, whatever. And they said, oh, no, that's not a problem. It's not a problem. It's not a problem. So my question to you is this. The real issue around the Sony side was the user behavior. Okay. And I know it's popular to make fun of users, et cetera. But do you think after Sony happened, President Obama went on television and asked everyone to really think in terms of cybersecurity and use better passwords and think in terms of protecting everything else? Because this was a nation state attack on our most precious commodity, our movie industry. Okay? And so he asked us, and do you think the users learned? Do you think they did? We don't have to wonder, because a social scientist went out on the street and asked a bunch of people the next week.
Today, we sent a camera out on the Hollywood Boulevard to help people by asking them to tell us their password. And this is how that went.
We're talking about cybersecurity today and how safe people's passwords are. What is one of your online passwords currently?
It is my dog's name and the year I graduated from high school.
Oh, what kind of dog do you have?
I have a Chihuahua Papillon.
And what's his name?
Jameson.
Jameson. And where did you go to school?
I went to school back in Greensburg, Pennsylvania.
What school?
Hempfield Area Senior High School.
Oh, when did you graduate?
In 2009.
Oh, great.
It's like my cat's name and then just like a random number.
Okay. Have you had this cat for a while?
Yeah, she's my childhood pet.
Aw. And what's her name?
Her name is Jolie.
Jolie. So like a password of yours would be Jolie and then a number.
Yeah.
Like number 1?
Like my birthday.
Oh, when is your birthday?
June 12th.
Oh, nice. Oh, what year were you born?
95.
Oh, great. So Jolie, 6/12/95. Yes. Got it.
So you mean to give my password right now?
Well, yeah, I'll let you keep watching. I'm really, really worried about time. But long story short, we could put in the most sophisticated controls. Oh, you want me to keep playing? I don't want to get booted out of here, but do you want to come back next year? We can put in the most sophisticated security controls. You could go to redact.link/history to see that whole video, by the way. There's even a follow-up 10 years later. But redact.link/history is what it said. Multi-million-dollar security budgets, all kinds of controls. You can hire the best security firms in the world. You can buy hardware. You can buy software. You can develop LLM models. At the end of the day, you've got the greatest suit of armor until there's a significant amount of Americans, probably about a third, that admit that they're reusing passwords on a daily basis. A third. There's a LinkedIn data breach from 2003 that if you take those files from that data breach, because it's unencrypted, it's not a hash table, it's actually the plain text passwords. Those passwords still work on other sites to this day. Please don't do that. Please don't look at that. But password reuse is sort of an issue. Okay, it's gotten to the point where I no longer talk about this being the issue. I'm saying passwords, period, is the issue. Right? Obviously, that control does not belong in the hands of folks that you're then going to blame for clicking things, right? And so a lot of things just say spun these controls up. I really wanted to get into the side about China, but we're gonna have to save that one for another day as well. Although I do want you to see this clip outside the Shanghai apartment building. This is what happens if you try to film the People's Liberation Army apartment complex in Shanghai. These guys can really, really run, by the way, very, very much. But so nation states were spending up this money. Ultimately, it became a matter of national defense, and the intelligence community, et cetera, eventually got to the point where the Office of Personnel Management was basically breached. And this was a particularly painful one, because not only do they have all my personal information, but they have the personal information of every reference that I'd given as well. So my neighbors, PII. My friends, my references, et cetera, for everybody who had applied to a government position across the board, this was massive. And here's the kicker about the OPM breach. Well, there's two kickers. Number one, the government paid us gave us credit monitoring. Here's your credit monitoring service. I think it was Equifax or Experian, one of the ones that got breached later. And number two, they never used the OPM data exploited for financial gain. It was never actually used or utilized. So we know for a fact that there's only one type of party that would want to hoard that data and kind of sweep it up. Okay. And we also know if you had that data on everybody with a security clearance in the United States, what kind of a database you would want to put that in, and what kind of models would you want to train with that data so that you had a dossier and a profile on every single person in the IC. Compounded this with the fact that every major casino has been hacked, Sabre has been penetrated, travel companies, Hertz Rental Car, everything else, and then, of course, Equifax. These companies. Ultimately, at the end of the day, if you really, really want to know where the most concise summary of information about yourself is, it's probably on a server in Shanghai right now, right? Because they've got very detailed information on pretty much every single American citizen. And they should. Information wants to be free, right? At the end of the day, these types of data breaches, which are just staggering, actually ended up leading to this bizarre situation around the election interference that led to this surreal moment that I just absolutely have to include in here, because I still, to this day, cannot watch this video without my jaw hitting the floor that this was real life and that this actually happened.
You're saying Russia, but I don't, maybe it was. I mean, it could be Russia, but it could also be China. It could also be lots of other people. It also could be somebody sitting on their bed that weighs 400 pounds, okay?
Now, I've struggled with my weight over the years quite a bit. I'd never hit 400 pounds, though, and I was a little bit offended by that particular notion. But the bottom line is, it wasn't a 400-pound guy sitting in his bed. We know exactly who it was. Other intelligence agencies were actually monitoring their cameras. We even know what times of day they were coming in and out, if you read the indictments, et cetera, that were there. And so if Sony Pictures Entertainment was the Holy Grail, when you start messing with and underpinning the democratic process or making people uncertain about what is true and what isn't true, right? That's a little bit more of that's hitting real close to some of those internal organs that are out there. Ultimately, this led to shadow brokers. The shadow brokers was a group of grammatically challenged individuals. This is by cover. And they doxed one of my best friends. They pissed them that they actually doxed one of the folks that's in our audience today. And this ultimately ended up leading to the release of some embarrassing files around both around the CIA's archive of offensive tools and some from NSA as well. And these tools were then later used to build exploits like Eternal Blue. The first time I ever loaded up Eternal Blue, I could not believe how well it worked. I was absolutely floored by how well it was written, how well it was done. I mean, to this day, there's still virtual machines I have that I can only open because I'd lost the passwords years ago, that Eternal Blue will just crack that sucker right open in the right VM, in the right environment. So, and again, it was absolutely mind-boggling. This was then turned into, from cyber weapon to stolen cyber weapon to propagated cyber weapon to ransomware attack vector, right? And this is the same cyber criminal games that are doing that. The reason I'm bringing all this up is because in the AI implications, we're going to see this same type of pattern, because we continue to see these same types of patterns over and over and over in other areas of the cyber fields. So the threat landscape includes nation states, sophisticated cyber games, and script kiddies. Well, where in the OpenAI ChatGPT world which ones of these groups can use ChatGPT? All of them. They absolutely can. All of them use them. And the government nation states can use their own sophisticated versions there as well. This ultimately led to the biggest innovation in our lifetimes that's happened, and that was transformers. And I can't quite get into this, but in 2017, there was a paper published called Attention is All You Need that basically lowered the amount of time for reinforcement learning, human reinforcement learning, down by orders of magnitude, thousands or 10,000 times. Okay, and that's really what led to the development around GPT-4. And the way it works is really fascinating. It's faking and guessing what the next word should be, and then that becomes the next word, right? When you ask it these questions and get these different answers, it's not really doing the reasoning, even if you've got the reasoning model turned on. It's faking it. But at some point, it's indistinguishable from reality from fake. A year ago, I would have been talking about hallucinations. We don't even really talk about hallucinations anymore because there's been mitigations around a lot of those as well, around panel of experts, etc. These are the LLMs of today. This is the things that you've been hearing about nonstop for the last couple of days, all around inverse reinforcement learning and that back propagation. And it's ultimately about the reduction. China, 3.5 weeks ago, released a model that completely changed everything we thought about these models because it was so much more efficient. We assumed that the cost of entry to build these was astronomically high from a data center standpoint and a power standpoint, but DeepSeek proves that you can actually do it for almost consumer level spend amounts that are out there. So I was actually seeing Jason Haddix earlier today talking about some of the things that we heard about yesterday about the first try fallacy. And the fact that one of the most challenging things about this for cyber is the fact that you cannot repeat this. One of the things about science that's so important, one of the things that's so important about peer review is being able to repeat it. Okay, you tell me you discover something, I say, show me or publish it. Okay, as Jake pointed out yesterday, you could run it 12 or 13 times and it only hits the 13th time. Why? Because that's how it's designed. It's designed to give unique answers every single time. And that's a particular challenge for us and one that we're going to have systems that come up for. Eventually, the machines did decide the only way to win is to not play. We don't have that luxury. We have to play, okay? Because we don't play, China's going to play, our competitors are going to play, and the folks that get AGI first are going to have an immense power differential over everyone else who's chasing behind them, right? And that is a little bit concerning. When we talk about the democratization of compute power, of thought, absolutely we want that in everyone's hands, except we want this to be a war games movie. We don't want this to become a different kind of movie. That's really my conclusion. By the way, I really appreciate everyone saying, I didn't even talk about MCP, but I promise that will be the next chapter, the next part too. The biggest takeaway that I really want to leave you with is this message, period. We can write our own. We can hack our own. We can write our own. And so let's train the planet. Thank you very much. That was you, Dan.